to climate change in our work, besides the fact that it affects what we do in the continent or what we do here in South Africa in promoting human rights education. We also looked at the fact that, one, there was the amplification of environmental rights by the UN Human Rights Council. That's one reason that we thought we should have this campaign. And the second reason is that the UN Children's Rights Committee is currently developing a new General Comment 27 that will look specifically at the impact of climate change on children's rights issues. And the third reason why we are here today is because I think for the first time, we will be hosting as a continent COP27 that will take place in Egypt later on during the year. So we thought as a center that we should as well have conversations around this issue, climate change, that is, because climate change affects affects our work, either through the promotion or the protection of rights as well in different parts of the continent, as we will hear from the presenters or from the speakers. But for us to officially open now, invite my colleague and our Assistant Director, Lloyd Kuveya, who is now going to give more or less like an opening and a welcome to this event. Lloyd. You can't hear me. Which microphone should I focus on? Or should I look at? This is fine. I'm so sorry. I have never, I was just going to say I've never spoken in front of so many microphones. Sorry, is it muted?
Yeah, it does. Okay. Yeah,
is this one okay?
Yeah, this one's fine.
All right.
It's fine. You can just speak.
Okay, thank you very much, Elvis. I hope you can all hear me at the back. You can hear me. Okay, thank you very much. And those online can hear me?
Yes.
Thank you so much. So thanks so much, Elvis, for really setting us up and setting the scene for the discussion for the launch today. Really excited because I think we have an excellent panel of speakers and discussants for this very important issue of climate change. But why climate change? Why are we sort of bringing it into the discussion on human rights? I mean, a lot I think has happened. Scientists have done a lot of research around the link between climate change and the negative impact on human rights, the violations of human rights, particularly in the global south. Researches have been done by certain other activists and international NGOs. One of the latest researches, I think for me, that has sort of stood out is a report by Amnesty International, which was launched in 2021. The title of that report, and they always come up with some very interesting titles of their reports, is Stop Burning Our Rights: What Governments and Corporations Must Do to Protect Humanity from the Climate Crisis. And indeed, I think when you look at that report, they have been able to come up with a link between the climate crisis and human rights violations. And they've stated, and what everyone else has also commented on, that climate crisis is really a human rights crisis of unprecedented proportions, which has led to so many violations of not just civil and political rights, but more importantly, economic, social, and cultural rights. We have seen how, because of climate change, so many people have been affected in terms of their ability to access food, to access water, to access housing. You know, I think we've just witnessed in Durban the floods that have left so many people homeless. We have seen loss of lives. We've seen damage to infrastructure, including schools, hospitals, and so on and so forth. And so really, in terms of the negative impact on socio-economic rights, we have really witnessed unbearable devastation. And unfortunately, a lot of the states in the global south have been unable to mitigate the negative impacts of climate change. And I think you're going to be hearing a lot more of this from our eminent speakers today. And one of the things I think that we are grappling with, at least in the global south, is the failure by most of the wealthy nations to take concrete commitments and actions to curb the frightening global warming that we're witnessing, which has led to so many severe climate impacts on the continent. Also, one of the most worrying issues, and I hope the speakers will cover that also, is the issue of climate financing. There have been commitments which have been made, but some of the commitments made, especially like at COP26 in Glasgow, only 42%, if you look at Glasgow going backwards, 42% of the commitments have been disbursed to countries. And unfortunately, also the climate financing has been more in the form of grants as opposed to loans. And as I think we all know what that means in terms of the debt crisis, especially that countries in the global south are facing. Some of the statistics are quite frightening. I'll just mention a few because I know that our speakers are going to go into all that. I think in 2019, we saw the cyclone that happened, which devastated Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and Malawi. Cyclone Idai, resulting in over 4 million people being affected, either through displacements, deaths, and so on and so forth. I think in terms of people who were killed, thousands of people died, including most recently in Durban, where close to 500 people were killed because of the floods that occurred there. The WFP has also predicted that a 20% increase in global hunger and malnutrition will occur by 2050 if the global warming is not curtailed. I mean, these are really, for me, frightening statistics. Another calculation was that between 2008 and 2018, during that period, over 20 million people annually are displaced internally because of extreme climate conditions. All these statistics are really frightening. And for us, I think that is why it is really important as Africa to start campaigning and fighting for climate justice. But what has caused the injustice? When you look at the impacts, you will realize that the climate crisis has disproportionately affected those people who are most marginalized, those people who are usually discriminated against as a result of the inequalities in distribution of resources, as well as some of the structural inequalities that you will see. When you look at, for instance, I'll continue to use the Durban example because it's the most recent one. Some of the people affected were people living in shacks. And so those houses are not really that strong. So when floods come, then those houses are most likely to be swept away, as opposed to people who can afford, who are in privileged positions, and who are staying in places where they will not be affected by severe climate events. Women are also, disproportionately affected because a lot of women are the ones who are involved in natural resources and the use of natural resources for livelihoods. So in agriculture, when droughts come and floods come, their crops are affected, and that has a negative impact on their livelihoods. And indigenous peoples as well are affected disproportionately because they rely largely on natural resources for their livelihoods, for their cultural identity, and so on and so forth. People with disabilities, you find that they are also disproportionately affected during climate crisis. They are the ones who really suffer most, and they are really exposed to the greatest risk. And you also find that most of the people that you find in the small island nations, including countries like Madagascar, and the least developed countries like Mozambique, are also disproportionately affected compared to colleagues in the global north. So for me, I think that's the injustice of all this phenomenon. And also more importantly, you find that 10 to 15% of the wealthy population in the world are the ones who are responsible really for over 50% of gas emissions, the cumulative historical gas emissions that we've witnessed. And yet, the rest of the population in the global south and other island nations that are affected, they've only contributed around less than 10% towards gas emissions. So you then realize that the people who are least responsible for gas emissions are the ones that are really most affected by the climate crisis. So I just wanted to sort of paint a small picture on why we are having this campaign. I think it's really important because of the injustices that we are seeing, and we are really looking forward as the center to having our speakers who speak more authoritatively and go into greater detail into some of the issues around climate justice. And we hope that we can create some appetite for climate justice campaigns, for climate justice advocacy amongst African activists, African lawyers, and other people who are concerned about the impact of climate change on the continent. And hopefully some of us in the room will be able to perhaps take part in COP27 in Egypt in November, as Elvis has stated. Thank you so much, Elvis, for the opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lloyd. Just have to make sure that you can hear me now. Is that fine with those at the back? Thank you. While I navigate myself through this extremely long CVs and bios that are very important, I'll ask my colleague Tatenda to cue the video. Just cue it for now, and I'll let you know when to bring it up. And then I will also, at the moment, invite one of the discussants who is with us in the hall now, Prof. Melanie Mercott, to take a seat next to me as well. So in our midst, we've been blessed, and I'll use the word blessed intentionally because we have some of the leading experts who are Africans with us, some of the leading experts who have done so many works around this issue of climate change. And to those who are master's students at the Center for Human Rights, you are also aware that within all the units, we have now also encouraged units to include in their work issues around climate change. And you all have assignments in that regard. The first keynote address will be given by Dr. Kumi Naidu. Now, I won't go through the entire bio because it's quite long, but we've distributed it already. So I'm going to pick up some key points on their bios. Kumi was the founding executive director of the South African National NGOs Coalition. For those of us who've been around for a while, we will know what Sangoko did back in the days and how we brought together civil society organizations in this country and rallied them with one voice in what they did. But currently he is the executive director of Greenpeace International. Now Greenpeace is a global network of independent campaigning organizations that use peaceful protests and creative communications to expose global environmental problems and promote solutions that are essential.
Sorry.
I think you need to intervene there.
Yeah, I was the
you were?
Yeah, a long time ago, from 2009 to 2015. Sorry.
Yes. Okay. Thanks. Thanks for that update. So long time ago, that is what he did, and that is why we have him here in our midst with us to share his experience during that time and what he did. And then we have with us as well Professor Loretta Ferris, who is with us now at the University of Pretoria. We are very blessed to have her with us. Prof was the Deputy Vice Chancellor for Transformation and Student Affairs at UCT from 2017 to March 2021, where she developed a framework for transformation that draws on her scholarly work on special justice and spearheaded an approach that introduced transformation benchmarks for higher education. During this time, she also developed a special tribunal for sexual and gender-based violence, a first in higher education, and towards the end of her term as DVC, she led work on critical approaches to racism in higher education. We all know these are also sentimental issues. that plague our country, South Africa, and the continent as well. But at this point, I'm going to pass on to my colleague, Tatenda, who is going to now play our promotional video before we now listen to the keynote speakers, starting with Dr. Kumi, Dr. Naidu, and then later on with Prof. Ferris.
Hi, my name is Jahira and I have muscular dystrophy.
Aslema, my name is Ilef.
Hi, my name is Masharia.
So the impact of climate change is unfortunately most felt by those who are the least responsible for it. Now, despite the minimal contribution of indigenous communities in greenhouse gas emissions, they still bear the direct consequences of climate change due to their dependence on environmental resources, which does not only threaten their traditional ways of life and their unique cultural norms, but also their survival, bearing into mind that they already suffer numerous human rights violations and political and economic marginalization.
Persons with disabilities form part of the population which is most vulnerable to the effects of climate change. This is often due to lack of inclusive policies and practices designed to mitigate or eliminate these effects.
Climate change threatens access to life-sustaining therapies such as breathing support during power outages. Additionally, too often, we're not planned for during natural disasters.
In the African context, indigenous communities need special protection against climate change effects, and their knowledge needs to be capitalized on and taken into consideration in the climate change assessment and policymaking processes on the continent.
Thank you. I'm sure some of you would have seen your colleagues in that recording. And thank you so much, Tatenda, for the communications department or unit rather, for putting that together for us. I will now pass on to Dr. Naidu, who is now going to give us his keynote. You have 10 minutes for that, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can I check whether I'm able to share my presentation? I'm not.
Yes, you can.
Okay, does it work?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, greetings, friends and colleagues. I'm reminded after that presentation by Lloyd and that wonderful short video, I'm reminded of a moment from the liberation struggle when you followed a speech like that. You started by saying most of the really good points I was going to be made have been eloquently made by the previous speakers. And then you said, however, for emphasis, and then you spoke for about 2 hours. But given the time constraints, let me just say that I'll readjust my comments slightly. But just to say that when we think about the state of the world and the state of our country, there's a very simple Afrikaans sentence that actually works really well. And it simply goes as, ons is deep, deep, deep in the kak, if you want to be absolutely blunt about it. And what COVID-19 did was pull back the curtains on the failures of our current economic system, agriculture system, energy system, and so on. What we also see is a convergence of multiple crises happening at the same time: inequality, structural racism, and so on, all converging at the same moment. So essentially, we are now in the most consequential decade in humanity's history. Why does one say that? According to the science from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, we have less than 10 years now to get emissions to peak and start coming down rapidly if we're going to prevent a global temperature increase beyond 1.5 degrees from the time that we started burning fossil fuels, oil, coal, and gas. Where are we now? We are already at 1.1 degrees of warming. And at 1.1 degrees of warming, we are already seeing such extreme weather events. So when we think about the future, we know for sure that the worst is ahead of us as we edge towards 1.2, 1.3, towards 1.5. In the Pacific, people already in 2015 and other parts of the global south have been chanting 1.5 to stay alive. But the slogan has even changed now, where people in vulnerable places on the continent as well as globally in the south are saying 1.5, we might survive. So let's be very clear. The struggle that we are engaged in on climate justice is not about saving the planet. It is about saving humanity. If we continue on the path that we're on, we eat the planet, we destroy our soil, we destroy our water resources. The end result is we will be gone, the planet will still be here. So everybody who's worried about saving the planet, don't worry. Once we become extinct as a species, the forests will recover, the oceans will replenish, and so on. So let us understand that what is at stake when we talk about addressing climate justice is about saving our children and their children's futures. So the impacts on climate change in Africa have already been considerable. We've seen rising temperatures, rising sea levels and coastal erosion, extreme weather events, food security impacts, health impacts, economic impacts, mass migration, and rising conflicts over resources. Then when we look closely at Southern Africa itself, Lloyd mentioned most of them. I'm not going to go into detail, but other than to say that the consequences on Southern Africa are going to be devastating in terms of food security, water availability, and so on, if we do not have big structural and systemic changes. But what we see with our governments, right? If you look at the 2008 global financial crisis, the response of those with power when we came out of the crisis, because the crisis was a teachable moment. It was telling us that the level of inequality cannot continue, that the level of lack of sensitivity, sustainability couldn't continue. But what we saw was an approach of system recovery, system protection, system maintenance. But what was needed then and what is urgently needed now as we move out of the COVID situation is we need system innovation, system transformation, and system redesign. Let's be very, very clear. Anybody that tells you right now that we can solve the climate crisis within the current economic system, within the current agricultural food system, within our current energy system is telling you a big lie and are in deep denial about how deep the crisis is already. So what are the solutions? So firstly, this is not in order of priority. We need a different mindset approach. Firstly, we need to understand that climate change is not an environmental problem. It's not sitting in a box somewhere. It is a problem that is cross-cutting. So we need to understand that intersectionality is the interconnected nature of social categorization such as race, class, and gender as they apply to a given individual or group, regarded as creating overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination or advantage. So we need to deploy that urgently. We need to break down the silos in our minds, our worlds, and our work, understand the nexus between the various crises that we are facing, use this new perspective to forge new pathways to justice that are embracing and understanding the intersectionality of the world's problems. The second thing we need to do is resist cognitive dissonance. right? Cognitive dissonance is a condition which many people are suffering from very badly at the moment, where the reality is there. All the cognitive facts are there that we need to act fast, act big, that baby step changes are not going to get there, but those with power are in serious denial. So sadly, President Ramaphosa has quite a serious case of cognitive dissonance. Minister Gwede Mantashe has, in fact, a super serious case of cognitive dissonance. And you go through the cabinet, you'll find different levels, but all of them, they say something that sounds like they get it, but they are in denial about how serious and how close to the climate cliff we are. The second thing we need to do is commit to creative maladjustment. What do I mean by this? We need to accept that lots of things in academia, in the science, and in activism that we have accepted as given, as norms, need to be challenged. Martin Luther King, speaking in 1965, he said, we must refuse to be adjusted to inequality, racial injustice, religious bigotry, and so on, and call for a new sense of activism where we do not accept the status quo, and we are committed to a creative maladjustment. We don't adjust to that which is unjust. The other thing that we need to do if we're going to solve the climate crisis is we need to cure the biggest disease that humanity faces, not COVID, but affluenza. And our entire political class suffers a very high level of affluenza at the moment. And affluenza can be described as a pathological illness where people have come to believe that a good, meaningful life comes from more and more material acquisitions. And sadly, with few exceptions, our political class is completely bought into that. They will sit in a negotiation and tell people, you know, you can live on 500 rands a month, and then they will complain that they cannot live on 200,000 rands a month. I hope you know who I'm talking about. So then, just to conclude, how do we get out of this mess? Let's be very clear that if we think putting all our eggs in the policy basket and trying to get our governments to change, we are wrong. That is not to say that we don't continue to push the policy as much as we can. That doesn't mean that we don't look at how to use litigation as much as we can. But let's be clear, the nature of the crisis that we face right now in South Africa, in Southern Africa, and globally requires a kind of popular mobilization that has never been seen before on the planet if we are to stand a chance to avert the worst of catastrophic climate change. Let's be clear, we are 5 minutes to midnight. The window of opportunity for us to make the changes that we need to make according to the science is small and is fast closing. So in that context, I want to, and I would love to hear Lyndon's reflection on it when she speaks. I think all of us now must remember what Amilcar Cabral, the West African anti-colonial leader, said when he said, tell no lies and claim no easy victories. So whether you come from business, whether you come from government, or whether you come from the NGOs and civil society more broadly, we must all stand up now and say, hey, we cannot continue to ignore what Albert Einstein said when he said that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting to get different results. And for us, I'm talking to Lyndon because we marched together at some point in our life in Greenpeace, we also need to look at whether, in fact, the fact that NGO activism focuses so much on what people don't have, you know, that people are marginalized, oppressed, excluded, and so on, that we forget that people still have immense amounts of agency. And that's what we need to focus on moving forward. We need to put people back at the center of this struggle. They've been spectators. And in this diagram up there, I'm not going to go through it in the interest of time, I identified 4 areas: harnessing our autonomy, harnessing our creative participation, harnessing our wealth, and harnessing our consumption power. We need to do all of this, and much more. And still, I would conclude by saying that does not guarantee us that we can make the big, massive structural and systemic changes fast enough to align to the science. But I'm told, I'm a bit pessimistic these days. People say I used to be very optimistic, and now when I talk, I'm a downer. So let me end on this note, that pessimism in this current moment of history is a luxury we simply cannot afford. The pessimism of our analysis right now about how bad things are can best be overcome by the optimism of our actions and creativity. The stakes are far too high for people to leave the struggle to avert catastrophic climate change in the hands of scientists only, or government only, or economists only. This is a struggle not simply about climate, but about reshaping the kind of economy we want so that we can live in greater equality, both in South Africa, in the country, and around the world. Thank you very much. And I apologize if it took longer than I should have. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You were actually on time. But and from what you just said, this is exactly what motivated us to try to infuse a people approach and also a multidisciplinary approach on how we can respond to the impact of climate change. It is there, we see it. We saw it in Durban, and early this morning, listening to Newsroom Africa, I learned through the news that about 20 million people in the Horn of Africa are at risk of drought, facing drought. And those of us who know what happened in Cape Town in, which year was that? 2017, I think. 2017, 2018, we know how devastating the drought can be as well. But without saying much, I will now move to our next speaker, Prof. Ferris, who is also going to give her own remark, and she'll have about 10 minutes as well. Prof.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm not able to start my video. If somebody can just assist. There we go. Great, thank you very much. So let me start by saying good afternoon to everyone, and thank you for this opportunity to be part of this launch. I cannot agree more with Kumi when he talks about the urgency of this campaign and the time, given the time that we are in. And so when I was considering the positioning of this campaign, namely the impact of climate change on the protection and fulfillment of human rights in Africa, I started to reflect on how knowledge, advocacy, and policy on climate change has actually evolved over the last few decades, and in particular, how it has evolved from being seen primarily as an environmental problem to one that is a human problem. And I want to focus on this evolution for my inputs. So of course, I want to preface this by just saying that some of us that has been working in the field of environmental law and human rights and sort of straddling those two areas believe fundamentally that people and environment are in fact integrated and cannot be seen as separate or apart, and have always argued that environmental problems are human problems. But having said that, in the early years of climate change, the scientific conversations, the knowledge production in particular around climate change were primarily focused on how climate change will impact the environment. And when I say early years of climate change, I'm really taking us back to over 100 years ago when climate change was first raised. In fact, one of the earliest studies was in 1896, when a Swedish chemist called Svante Arrhenius concluded that industrial age coal burning will enhance the natural greenhouse effect. Ironically, he thought that this may be a positive development for humans. And so over the next 100 years, there was significant development in science, unpacking the impact of not just fossil fuels, but a number of greenhouse gases, on the rise in global temperature and how that's going to impact on the natural environment, terrestrial, marine biodiversity, on oceans, on glaciers, etc. And this created, of course, sufficient concern for the establishment of what we now know as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, who was established in 1988, primarily to collate and assess the evidence on climate change. And the first IPCC panel report in 1990 concluded at the time that temperature have risen by 0.3 to 0.6 degrees Celsius over the last century. And as a result, partly of that, but also as a result of the kind of activism that started during that period, At the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro in 1992, governments agreed to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And so I think this became a kind of a pivotal moment in knowledge production on climate change, as it propelled the issue on the agenda of not just government, but also academics. And interestingly, we also during this time, talking from a legal perspective, we started to see legal scholarship on climate change. But once again, if we look at that early scholarship on climate change, it is clear that the focus was primarily on climate change and its environmental impacts, and suggesting policy changes, development of regulatory frameworks, and how that can mitigate the impact of climate change. And to the extent that there was a focus on climate change litigation, it was primarily aimed at making the case for litigation that will compel governments to take action towards mitigation. However, in the decades that followed, the IPCC report started to evolve from looking purely at environmental impacts of climate change to also include the socioeconomic impacts. And of course, we need to keep in mind that the reports of the IPCC are in essence a literature review, right? So in other words, what they present us with is their assessment of the scholarly literature on climate change. So in other words, we're beginning to see a shift over the last few decades where the focus has started to be on socioeconomic impacts of climate change in the scholarly literature. So in the 2001 report, the IPCC for the first time placed a strong emphasis on adaptation, speaking to adjustments in ecological systems, but also social and economic systems in response to climate change impacts. And in its 2007 report, the fourth report of the IPCC, it makes the statement that unmitigated climate change would in the long term be likely to exceed the capacity of natural, managed, and human systems to adapt. And so over the next few reports of the IPCC report, we are beginning to see two themes emerging much stronger. On the one hand, we observe an urgency in the call for change to stem the rise in global temperature. And on the other hand, a more pertinent focus on how the increasing magnitudes of global warming will increase the likelihood of severe, pervasive, and irreversible impacts on the environment, but also as a result on people. So we are here now in 2022, where we no longer have conversations about climate change without emphasizing its impact on humanity. And I would suggest that the reason why we have seen the sense of urgency and the increased focus on the interrelationship between environment and people is that we are now living, as we have said now for the last few minutes, the reality of climate change. It is no longer a prediction. We are experiencing the impacts of climate change. One of the websites that I follow is by a group called Floodlist. It's an organization that compiles data on major flood events around the world. So as I was preparing for these inputs, I went to look at what are the major news reports that they are citing just for the last month, right? So this is just for this month. So let me read you the entries for this month. Tanzania, floods in the south leave 5 dead, thousands displaced. Guadalupe, deadly flight strike after 300 millimeters of rain. Venezuela, fatalities and evacuations after floods hit several states. Brazil, flooding in the Jar River affects thousands. DRC, Congo, and Rwanda, 20 killed in floods and landslides. Colombia, emergency declared after deadly landslides. Uzbekistan, deathly floods and mud floats strike after torrential rain. The list goes on and on and on. And of course, they include South Africa and the death toll in KwaZulu-Natal in this as well. And so we are beginning to live the impacts of climate change. We are in the midst of a very real crisis. And yes, it is, as we have now heard, a human rights crisis. But I also want to stress this. It is also an environmental crisis. And I want to suggest that because we have for so long ignored this relationship between people and the environment, that we are now here, where we are now for the first time seeing how an environmental crisis becomes a human crisis and a human rights crisis. But I do want to caution us. On the one hand, I think human rights activists and lawyers have for too long narrowly valued human life without making an effort to understand the complex relationship between us and the natural environment. Environmentalists, on the other hand, as we've seen in the evolution of the IPCC reports, have in a misguided manner placed the environment on a pedestal to be conserved only for its ecological value, but not for its human value. And so we need to be mindful that this is not actually a healthy way to understand the climate crisis that we're in. It's not about either or. It's not about either the environment or either human rights. It's about both. And I think we can learn from indigenous communities and their relationships with nature. Here's why. A joint report by the International Working Group for Indigenous Affairs and in the ILO noted in 2021 that indigenous peoples were responsible for protecting an estimated 22% of the planet's surface and 80% of biodiversity. The reasons for this level of protection, I believe, is because, as Enrique Salmon reminds us in his article, Kin-Centric Ecology, Indigenous Perceptions of the Human-Nature Relationship, that indigenous people view nature as part of an extended ecological family that shares ancestry and origins. It is an awareness that life in an environment is viable only when humans view the life that surrounds them as kin, as relatives. So the interactions that results from this is what he refers to as a kin-centric ecology, which enhance and preserve the ecosystem. However, without human recognition of their role in the complexities of life in an ecosystem, the life suffers and loses its sustainability. So I want to leave the center with this reminder, and I want to suggest and perhaps advise that for this campaign to succeed, it needs to adjust the human rights lens so that it embraces the environment and care for the environment in and of itself. Because if we now only focus on how climate change impacts people, life will suffer and lose its sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for those concluding remarks. That was quite inspiring as well. And we've taken great notice of that remark. At this point, colleagues, I would like to, without waste of much time, but just to invite all of us now to a different phase of this campaign, of the launch of this campaign, which is a discussion point, a point where you'll be allowed to raise questions. And we've also assembled an esteemed panel that will also give their opinion on 4 issues or 4 items that we have identified as crucial for us to discuss during this lunch. The first will be the current and the prospective severity of climate change in Africa, which in a way the keynote panelists have highlighted intensively. And then we have the second point, the ability and the capacity to deal with the impact of climate change, both individual and corporate social responsibilities. And thirdly, we have climate change and gender-based health and economic disparities in Africa. And the last point will be climate change litigation. And this last point, for those who are lawyers or lawyers in the world, is very important in the sense that at the national level, yes, we have some litigation, so some cases already at the courts or in courts. We've not yet seen cases at the regional and levels yet in this continent. This is what some of the things that we want to see going on, or that we want to inspire as we unfold this campaign. So on this panel, this discussion panel, I invite everyone, including the keynote speakers as well, that they could interject maybe to make a point or a certain idea or to ask questions to these colleagues who are on the panel. We have first Prof. Melanie Mercott. Melanie is an associate professor in the Department of Public Law at the Faculty of Law at the University of Pretoria. I think I'll leave it there for now. And then we have Advocate Louisa Zondo. I've seen a revised version of this spell. Advocate Louisa Zondo is the former board secretary and board chair of Oxfam South Africa. She also served for the last year as interim executive director of Oxfam in South Africa. And there's quite a long list of, and in 2010, more importantly, Louisa was appointed to the National Advisory Council Innovations Committee on Science, Engineering, and Technology for Women. And in 2012, she was appointed a member of the council. And the next person that we have on our list is a friend and a colleague at the Center for Environmental Rights. Lynn holds an LLB from Wits University and an LLM in International Human Rights Law from the University of Notre Dame. Lynn heads the Corporate Accountability Unit at the Center for Environmental Rights. The third is one of us, and I mean one of us. She's currently doing an LLG year, but has worked extensively across the continent to promote issues around environmental rights or whatnot. Chiefly, Lynn was or participated in a group of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa Mining Vision Advisory Group and contributed to the drafting of the African Mining Vision of 2023 or 2030 rather, and that is still ongoing at the moment. She also comes to a huge history of promoting environmental rights, both as an activist and as a scholar. So these are the four colleagues that we have put together to discuss on these issues. I will skip the first point, which is the current and prospective severity of climate change in Africa, because this has been dealt with extensively by Lloyd, Kumi, and Prof. Ferris. But the second point that I will start, and I would like to invite Melanie to start that point before the other discussants will give input on it, is the ability and capacity to deal with the impact of climate change, both from an individual perspective. I think we heard Kumi raise that a lot, and as well from a corporate social responsibility perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Great. Well, it's wonderful to be here at the Center for Human Rights, and I think it shows what Loretta was speaking about in terms of the evolution of breaking down silos and engaging with environmental issues as part of a broader human rights agenda. And so there are a few things I would say with that in mind that we can do at an individual and a more systems level to respond to the problem of climate change. And I completely agree with Kumi's points about how we need to move forward, that we need systemic and structural change. And that's quite challenging or scary as individuals to think about how can I be part of systems change or structural change. And of course, one of the ways is through our writing and our activism. And so if we aren't already part of movements, we can think about joining movements or participating in movements. One of them that's really important and doing some brilliant work is the Climate Justice Charter movement. And they are establishing, they've drawn up at least a charter for climate justice that they are trying to get before Parliament and Parliament to adopt to inform the climate justice agenda in South Africa. And it's also a brilliant starting point for research in terms of, from a multidisciplinary lens, how can we advance climate justice? What are some of the key agendas for climate justice for African scholars? And then from a more, so I think that I would say as an individual, become part of a movement, understand what the movements are pursuing. Another really interesting movement is the Life After Coal movement, which is advocating for a just transition away from energy produced by coal. And then from a corporate social responsibility perspective, I think that corporations need to really actively move away from energy produced by fossil fuels and so advance the just transition. And there is a lot of talk about this, but not enough action. And I'll leave it there for other panelists to comment.
Thank you so much for opening that. I would like to invite Louisa, maybe to also look at the point where will we, or is there any hope that we will completely move away from coal and to other methods of generating energy in the same light of corporate responsibility or social responsibility?
Thank you very much.
I'm not sure whether you are hearing a beeping sound in my background. It is because we have load shedding and now using the alternative power that is accompanied by sound, but I hope it doesn't disturb too much. Thank you very much for the question. There is hope. There must be hope. I do firmly believe in the positive input that has been given by both Kumi and the fellow keynote speaker, Loretta, because there must be hope. Otherwise, humanity is bracing itself for the exact outcome that we purport to be fighting against, and that is our dissipation in circumstances that are truly, truly not justified. So there is hope. And I believe that the hope is in us not losing the major questions. Loretta couched the major questions so poignantly when she refers to this connection to the environment and placing the environment as part of our kinship. Because even as Kumi says, there is cognitive dissonance, which causes the political class, and I would say political extended to the economic and social elites, to refuse to see what the reality actually is. I see that problem as a fundamental inability to remember who we are. Who are we in the universe? And once we unpack that question of who we are, we start seeing that there is no way in which we can remove access and connection to land and expect that human beings will remain in a space of good mental health. They will be stable and be fully productive as human beings and be fully interactive when the violence of erasure of who people are, because the connections to the lived experiences of perpetuating their cultural connections, being anthropologically who they truly are, and thriving from that, their histories are erased. Then we do not expect that we will have a world or a humanity that is able to achieve these outcomes. So I do want to go and take us way back and say, we may have the campaigns, we may pour in the resources, the money, the time, the creativity of bringing up policy change. But before we understand that human beings are at the center of it all, and we find ways to change our psyche, to build a healthy kinship mindset, we probably will be missing the mark for many, many more decades if we are still around. So there is hope, and the hope is in the building of an integrative way of seeing ourselves as human beings in this world and interacting with the various disciplines that we interacting with the various spheres of human endeavor. From that point of being integrated, of being part of it, we then build safe communities. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I would like to invite Lindley now, given the fact that Louisa just ended with a very strong statement of looking more at point of individuals, human beings, and how we can, in a way as well, curb the impact of climate change, our own individual contribution. So my question in this regard is, when we look at the poor and the vulnerable, those who live in areas such as Durban that was affected, and in countries like Madagascar, we had a student here last year who couldn't travel back after studies because that country was locked down due to the cyclones that were taking place in that country. But Lindley, at this point, maybe from the corporate part, we've heard from Louisa and herself, from Melanie, what they could do. What I'm asking myself now is, as an individual, what responsibilities do I have to contribute to evade the impact of climate change in our beloved continent?
Thank you, Viz. Can you hear me? Is it good? Wonderful.
Yes, we can.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to the previous contributors. Kumi, it's a pleasure to share a platform again with you. And also, Prof. Melanie, good to be speaking here with you. Listen, Africa faces a conundrum, right? In this climate crisis, one that Africa seeks and is thirsty for development. You can look at it all throughout the political statements that are made from the AU to all countries in Africa. There is a developmental agenda that is being trickled down. And we all know that, the developmental agenda has to be fueled by what? One of the pillars of development is energy. Energy in Africa today, in the case of South Africa, is derived from coal. At least 90% of it is derived from coal, which is a major cause of the climate crisis. So if you connect that trail and you look at the developmental issues for Africans and individuals in this case, and you look at the issues of the climate crisis, it places Africa in kind of like between a rock and a hard place. What do we do? And what does the individual do? First of all, I would like to affirm what was said by the other speakers, that, there is nothing about environmental rights being a second or third generation rights or any other rights. Ken Saro-Wiwa did say that, the environment is man's first right, and referring also to Professor Loretta, who said that, we Africans, indigenous people, our forefathers had a spiritual, cultural connection to the environment. So there's no way that you can disassociate yourself from the environment and say, I want to pursue other rights such as political, economic, and social cultural rights while destroying the environment. There's an intersectionality about it that every individual has to embrace in the choices that they make, but also in the various actions that they take on. Talking about how we address this climate crisis now as Africans, we have hard choices to make at the political level, corporate level, but also at the individual level. There needs to be a sort of realization and a systematic change in the mindset. Kumi referred to affluenza. There's this thing about the more we get, the more, our lifestyle, the desire for more and more and more. I'm not saying that electricity is not needed. We do need energy, but what kind of energy choices we make individually and also corporately is very relevant. Working with Kumi, we pressured a lot of corporates to make right choices about, what kind of energy sources they take on, especially in the context of South Africa. However, at the individual level, we also have the right to say no. I refer you to the Himba people in Namibia who stood up against a perceived clean energy project. It was a hydro dam project. And these people said, well, we are not going to allow this dam to come and dam our land, which would deprive us of our cultural rights, our social and economic rights. We wouldn't allow it. And they said no. They rose up and they said no. Now, this is interesting because it is not a coal project. It could be seen as a clean energy project. But there is the right to say no at an individual level, but also as a community level, which points to what Kumi was saying, that where is the mass mobilization that we all need to stand up and say we can make better choices as Africans. And we've seen a lot of communities in South Africa that Professor Marcotte referred to. We've seen a lot of cases that are saying no to, case law, saying no to coal. We've also seen that across the continent. But I think individual choices need to shift. It needs to bring that systematic change where we make cleaner decisions as individuals. That's the first one. The second thing is about this, I just want to repeat it, is that even if we do pursue this right of development, what developmental choices are we making? Referring back to our colonial days and what happened in the past, I think we have adopted a sense of development that is not unique to who we are as a people. And we need to go back to that and redefine. There has to be a system change on what is it, what kind of development are we seeking as Africans? And that's what I fail to see, because it's a kind of development that would replicate the damages that the West have done. And now we're seeing the consequences of it on the climate crisis we make. And my last point is on the impacts. Yes, we are feeling the impacts. Africa and Africans are going to feel the impacts more and more. If there's anyone who says they have not felt that impact, I would say that's a lie. What do we do about it? Do we complain and not take action, or do we go out and take courageous actions and put that out there to tell courageous actions of African stories? Like, be out there, mobilize, get together, the power to say no, the power to stop being victims and being doers by making cleaner choices, the power to mobilize your community, your local community, and say, well, this is not in my backyard campaign. This is not going to happen in my backyard. That can happen when we all realize that we can choose our future. Yeah, which can not be by a northern or western form of development. It should be dictated by the cleaner form of development. I'll stop there for now.
Thank you so much. What you just presented now reminded me, by the way, I need to make a disclaimer. I am not a marketing officer for Netflix, but I watched a movie on Netflix sometime back. The boy who harnessed is it the wind, which was based on a true story of what happened in Malawi due to drought. So if you have access to that, please watch it. If you have, then I'm sure you must have learned something from that. But so I would like to invite now Leanne. Am I pronouncing it well? Leanne. Yes. So I'd like to invite Leanne, who actually heads a unit at the Center for Environmental Rights on corporate responsibility, to give us, in a way, her experience in the field and what she encounters on a daily basis. And again, I'll ask you the question of hope. Based on what you see and what you interact with in your line of work, do you think there is hope that corporates will completely, in terms of generating power, migrate from coal? I know that Luisa has given a very, very succinct and great answer, but what I want to hear from you is your own experience in the field and how you've interacted with this issue. Thank you.
Thanks, Elvis, and thank you, everyone. It's really great to be a part of this panel today. And I must commend the Center for Human Rights, which has for so long kind of led the research and discourse around human rights on the continent, and being able to bring together so many excellent scholars to discuss these issues, but importantly, take action like this campaign aims to do, this Green Justice campaign. And I think I'd like to focus on something that Lin has asked in her presentation, where she said, what kind of development are we looking for? And what kind of development are we looking for on the African continent? Because I think this is such an exceptionally crucial question that ties into the campaign's objectives in using the Green Recovery Action Plan, the AU Green Recovery Action Plan, which relies in turn on the SDGs. And this question of development arises again and again. And there's a real practical question to be asked around how do we determine what kind of development we would like on the continent? And in recognizing that we must all play a role, right? As activists, lawyers, community activists, researchers, even policymakers, etc., in doing our part to address the climate crisis. One of the things that CR has worked on, and as part of the Fair Finance Coalition Southern Africa, is to ask this question of development for who and what type of development in the context of engaging with development finance institutions themselves. And I think it's a really good example of something really practical that can be done by coalitions in Southern Africa, in different regions across the continent, to being able to engage with development finance institutions like the African Development Bank, for example, being able to ask, okay, if there's this Green Recovery Action Plan, and if we need financing to support this plan, how are we involved in assessing the projects that are approved? So like on a fundamental and practical level, is there transparency in respect of projects that are being approved? How do we access the project terms, particular loan agreements? Are community members involved in respect of determining what kind of land use arises from particular developments? And I think this is something we really need to consider, because there are so many questions that arise when we say climate finance to meet specific objectives, whether it is the AU Green Recovery Plan or individual country plans, country recovery plans. Because if we don't ask very, very specific questions around what climate finance is advancing, how climate finance is advancing development in Africa, we're potentially missing out on an incredibly important kind of opportunity, an influencing opportunity. And one example that I'll provide is how, as the Fair Finance Coalition Southern Africa, we're seeing climate finance being channeled towards gas and nuclear. So Elvis, in saying that, okay, we want to get rid of coal, for example, okay, and it's become, for economic reasons, environmental reasons, unsustainable, no longer viable, right? And there's a lot of details around this, and I'll come back to it. But in as much as we have seen a slowing down in the use of coal, increasingly you're seeing financing towards gas as a transition fuel, and this reliance on somehow nuclear and gas being cleaner forms of energy. And so as civil society actors, as coalitions, as part of this campaign, for example, we've got to engage with these issues, be able to go to DFIs and say, look, this is what guides us from a principled perspective in what we regard as the just transition. And Melanie has already referred to the Life After Coal campaign, for example, and they have this excellent document, which is the Life After Coal Open Agenda, and I'll put the links into the chat, which has been discussed with and arises from communities saying this is the kind of transition that we would need, a just energy transition that puts people first. And these are the kinds of principles we need to be able to reflect on and use in our engagements with corporations, with policymakers, with development finance institutions, within kind of African human rights mechanisms, and really be able to say, look, the SDGs have been fundamentally redefined over the last while to ensure biological diversity, to ask citizens and societies to reconsider how they interact with the natural world in the context of sustainable development. And how do we go about doing that? And what are the practical ways we're able to do that? So I know I've touched on a few topics at a very high level, but I think, from my side, on the last question that you asked, Elvis, in terms of hope and where do you see the future of coal, I think all of us who are working on these issues from the various perspectives that we are working on them must have hope to do this work. It is so essential in order to sustain the energy that we need to be able to do this work effectively and to do this work collaboratively. So I would say that, we are incredibly hopeful that we're able to do this work and meet certain commitments, meet certain targets. It's not easy, but as your own coalition and campaign is showing, as this own discussion is showing, we're all approaching this from different angles and different perspectives. And collectively, when we bring those resources together, we can only hope to move the dial.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. We now move to the third point. And please, if you have any questions, do not feel you can raise your hand or interrupt me, and we'll give you the floor to pose your question to any of the panelists. Next issue that I want us to discuss is around the impact of climate change on gender-based health and economic disparities. Now, this is a common issue. We've seen it. We've seen that those who are mostly affected in our communities are mostly, in most cases rather, women. And we also have children who are also affected. It reminds me of what I watched on Saturday on TV, Newsroom 24 again, of this family who lost 6 members of their family, and they were being buried on Saturday. Now, 6 of them, they're mostly children, the 6. And the girl child is involved and all whatnot. So I don't know if climate has an eye for gender, or if it has a particular focus on a particular gender. But these are realities. These are things that we face. And for us to understand the impact of climate change on issues related to gender-based health and economic disparities as well in Africa. So I would like to invite our panelists maybe to give an insight on this. It would be important that maybe if we raise some examples of what has happened in different parts of this continent, and maybe also shed some light on how we can maybe help as individuals or corporate to evade this pandemic, I dare say. I would like now to invite, maybe we'll start with Lin. And I'm inviting you specifically based on your contribution to the African Mining Vision 2023. I had a glance at that instrument, and I see that it also, in a way, also has a people or a gender approach to it. Lin?
Yes, thank you so much, Elvis. And thanks for referring to my work on the African Mining Vision on natural resource. It was around natural resource governance, but the impacts of climate change and even natural resource management on the continent is one that is personally has touched me, but also just to say that natural resource management and governance in Africa has been the source of many conflicts. One which affects both genders, but also women. That's one. I personally am a child of a civil war in Liberia, which was, we all know about the issues of the civil war in Liberia, where it was over natural resource management, conflict diamonds in Sierra Leone that followed the civil war in Liberia. That has happened, is happening even today. We see the war in Mozambique over gas. Our colleague referred to gas being the alternate source of fuel, and how many women and children are being displaced in northern Mozambique, while Total is being protected by the government, by government militia. Yeah, why Total, the mining company, is being protected by government militia. So there's a disproportionate way our governments have been dealing with the effects of natural resources management on communities, on women, and also even the way the climate crisis is going to affect women. Research has shown that, when mining or coal or whatever comes into a community, the first thing is that women who do not have land rights from the patriarchal system that we are living in Africa are the first ones to lose any access to their lands. They're the first ones to lose sources of livelihood. And they bear the burden of providing for the family, even if they're not recognized for that. We all know that. There's a lot of research that has proven that, women bear the burden of providing for the family, and they are not acknowledged for that. They don't have the land rights, or they don't have access to livelihood opportunities that other men will have. So that has been established even within the natural resource sector. Yeah, we know about children who are minors within who are slave miners in the Congo. We've seen horrible images of that. We've seen children who have to leave school to go into all sorts of illegal forms of mining. In Ghana, it used to be called galamsey mining, where children, well, that's when I did that study, where children had to go into the mining sector and just fall out from school to provide for the family. We have seen the unequal, or let me say the embarrassing form of compensation that is given to land acquisition when it comes to taking land over for mining purposes, or even, in those days, a tree would be valued, a cocoa tree would be valued at $1, at $1. And then if you count how many cocoa trees you have on your farm. So like the huge corporate disrespect and abuse of rights of women, and I would say of community members, has been documented, which is an embarrassment. And I know that a lot of work has been done. I did some work on that around business and human rights principles. But let's just come to what is happening today within the climate crisis that we see. We see a replication of that. We see women bearing the brunts of the climate crisis, losing their livelihoods, losing their homes, especially in a society where women have no say. But I want to, that's what's happening. I just want to end this intervention with hope, with a word of hope. I am excited by the powerful women and the community women who are standing up to claim their rights, who are standing up to defend their community on this continent. I was on a panel about a week ago with an all-female panel that discussed energy transition, social justice issues, and well-learned community activists who came on board and knew exactly what to say. There's so many of them. There's my friend Samantha is leading Women and Mining in Africa. We used to work together, and she's doing an amazing job in just educating women on their right to say no, on their right to say no to my land, free, prior, informed consent. Women are standing up to protect not just their right to say no to the land, but also their right to decide what I want to do with the land I own. I think there is hope. I want to end on that positive. I think there is hope that women are taking charge of not just being the victims, but actually standing up and claiming their rights. Thanks, Elvis.
Thank you. Just to remind the panelists that we've been given, maybe the next 15 minutes or so, we should be rounding off. So what we're going to do now is ask if there is any burning issue on this specific item that any of the panelists would like to add to what Lin just said.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to contribute, if I might. Firstly, just to say that if any of you watching online or in the audience were wondering why I got onto this panel, that you can see the organizers needed a little bit of gender balance based on the respondents and the keynote speakers. So I have no illusions as to why I was invited. But let me just be quite clear. Climate change is a feminist issue for multiple reasons in addition to what has already been said. Let me say the one issue that we don't talk about sufficiently, and that is the CIA and the Pentagon in 2002 already agreed that one of the worst impacts from climate change is going to be increasing conflict and war, right? I mean, they're not necessarily the closest allies of the environmental movement, right? And I don't necessarily quote the CIA and the Pentagon that often as a source, but on this one, take it that they're right? That the biggest threats is going to come from the, and they're quite right from where they said it. So now we know in all war, right, and all conflict, that women and children suffer so much more, right? And I think that needs to be acknowledged. The one question that I just want to, while I have the floor, that came up that I just want to contribute to, and it's sort of a little bit of a disagreement that I might have with both Lyndon and Louisa in terms of how we calibrate. I mean, I agree with the substance of what both of you said, but I think there's a little bit of a nuance that I'm anxious about. And that is when we start saying that individuals must be making choices and individuals must, for example, recycle, travel in a particular way and so on. And I think that the big corporations and the way the global narrative has gone, corporations have deflected the responsibility in ordinary people. When ordinary people saying we want to travel, they're not saying we want to travel in fossil fuel based energy. They're saying we want to travel. That's a right? So the right to certain things, some of which are basic needs, should not be put on people. So I'm not saying either of you said that, but I think we must be very careful while on the one hand encouraging individual agency, individual behavior and so on, not let in the process the corporate sector to get away and governments to get away with saying, oh, it's not our problem that we fail to offer you alternatives, it's your problem that you're denying it. And the last thing I wanted to say and I want to say it very explicitly, and this is going to be controversial, but I ask and I appeal to our leadership in our country to hear the sentiment, right? And that is, I, from 40 years of activism in our country, do not accept that our government is committed to addressing rural people and the poorest people, many of whom are women, right? Mm-hmm. If you take one Gupta Zuma corrupt thing, if you just take just the money that the Gupta stole from the rail project from China, which is about 50 billion rand, right? If you just take that money, right, that could have solarized more than half the villages across our country, and we could have electrified people. The reason our government and many governments across the world, as well as on this continent, stick to big infrastructure projects like nuclear, coal, and so on, rather than going for decentralized ways of delivering energy that is cheaper, that reaches people more environmentally friendly, and gives people control and access, the answer is simple. And we need to call it. This is the answer. The corruption, the supply chain of corruption in big fossil fuel-based projects is juicier, is deeper, it's irresistible for our political leadership. Let me just quite say though, it's not to say that renewable energy projects are, immune from corruption. We have such talented corrupt politicians in our country. I can guarantee you they'll find ways to do it. However, the scope for corruption in big projects is where you get the biggest level of stealing. And I say today to President Ramaphosa and to Minister Mantashe, you have to show that you care for people in rural areas in particular, and people who don't have, I find it very, very offensive and unacceptable that Minister Mantashe can accuse us of being anti-development. All of his infrastructure projects, go look at the things that they have done over the last 20 years. How much of that has served the poor and the rural people, and how much of them has served the political and business class of our country who have benefited and stole from our people. And we need to start talking like that in that language, because if we don't, then we are colluding. And as academics, if I can make a point to the academia, not just those here, whoever gets to hear this, today we need the input and the courage of the intellectual class like never before. People in academia need to actually stand up and tell it as it is, and tell us when we are in denial. And I think that it is only then will we get a chance to get our government to lead in the way that they need to. Thank you, and sorry I took so long.
No worries. The issue of embezzlement, kleptomania, and poor budgetary prioritization is an epidemic in this continent. And we hope that they will be able to hear you out, and that we could prioritize some of our budgetary concerns to direct them to respond to some of these issues. The reason why I'm saying this is because what happened in Durban is not for the first time. It has happened before. It happened this year, and it will happen again next year. But now I pass over to Melanie. You had something to say. Yeah, just for this point, yeah.
Thanks. So one of the things that I think we all need to reflect on is how the crisis that we're in is a crisis of power. And one of the major systems that is responsible for that power is capitalism, and we're skirting around it without saying it. And as lawyers or legal scholars or multidisciplinary human rights scholars, we need to be reflecting on that and how we feed into that system. Another point is that that very same system often forces us into false binaries. So environment or people, rural or urban, individual or community. And we need to ask ourselves, are these separations real, or are they imposed on us by a system that is trying to serve itself and continue to flourish? And how can we resist those false binaries? How can we advance the environment and people, communities and individuals? And a lot of that is about challenging the system that we're in and trying to break away from that. And that does mean decentralizing, so breaking down the power. And it means listening. A lot of what has been spoken about means listening to what do women in rural communities say. And I was at a very interesting panel on a workshop on developing a paradigm of harmonious coexistence to replace sustainable use of natural resources. So humans and the environment harmoniously coexisting, as opposed to humans using and commodifying the environment. And one of the most important things that came out of that workshop was from indigenous communities who were present, who said, we do, that's what we do, we coexist. And there's of course contestation in the coexistence, but if you as academics could record how we do that and learn from it and capture that knowledge before it's lost, that could be one of the most important things we can do to advance women's rights, to advance struggles against gender inequality, and to respond to the climate crisis in a collective fashion.
We have a question. Thank you so much, Melanie. We have a question from one of our participants here. It's not a question.
It's a comment.
Okay. Okay.
Hi, everyone. My name is Loretta from Malawi, and I am the National Chairperson of Young People in Mining in Malawi. So I wanted to comment on the climate change and gender equality through our experience in mining and my work around mining in Malawi. I want to agree with the previous speaker who talked about mining situations in their country. And I just want to say the impact of mining on the environment or climate is very devastating. For instance, in Malawi, we have a lot of illegal mining, and we also have legal mining where the government does offer licenses to companies and foreign investors. But there's a lot going on between the mining companies and the community, as well as the devastating impact that has on the women and the well-being of the children as well. One of the recurring challenges that we face in Malawi with regards to climate change and gender equality is that being a patriarchal nation, men have the right to land more than women. So they tend to make decisions with regards to what should be done with the land. So most of the times when the mining companies are, compensating people and whatnot, men are the ones who receive the money. And when they receive the money, they do not use that money to cater for the family. They use it for something else. And then now the burden of taking care of the women and sustaining the family, taking care of the children, and sustaining the family lies on the women. And then what happens is we have a lot of single-headed households who do not have any means to take care of the children. We also have a lot of moral decadence in terms of sex work being the only means that women can use to sustain their livelihood and take care of the children, because then they use illegal mining, or they do sex work within the illegal mines to be able to earn something. And because of that, we've also experienced a lot in terms of a lot of school dropouts and early pregnancies, because then the people who work in the mines and the people who work in the mining companies tend to rule out young girls, so then they could have sexual activities with them. And then also children prefer to go to illegal mines so that they could make little money instead of attending school. So those are just the things that I was covered. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that insight from Malawi. I just want to move this a bit faster, or maybe quicker, so that we look at each round litigation. But I'm going to ask this to everyone, including the keynote panelists. So as I indicated from the beginning, we don't have a lot of litigation, a lot of cases on this, but I have a strong belief that we can hold the state, we can hold governments accountable for the impact of climate change and how it destroys lives and livelihood. In fact, houses and all what we've seen in Durban. I also mentioned Madagascar, and I mentioned the fact that early this morning, there are threats of droughts will affect about 20 million Africans. When I mean the Horn of Africa, I'm looking at Ethiopia and those countries that are right there on that the Horn or the map, right there.
Elvis online.
Yes, please.
Yes, Kennedy here.
Hi, Kennedy.
Yes, I'm one of the LLM students for HGRA, and I would like first of all to applaud the Center for Human Rights for having this campaign, because in the international forum, we only see such powerful discussions only in the G7 summits, where we don't really take much time to have such a campaign on our own. So I really see this as a good way forward. And I'd also like to thank all the panelists for the wonderful presentations they've made in regards to this. Hinting on what Moma has said, Africa is still behind. We need to develop. We feel we have a lot of resources that we need to exploit. We have forests, abundance of land, which can be taken away for farming. We need to build houses, so the swamps have to be reclaimed for us to make bricks, and a lot of raw materials that we need day and daily. But the issue is, states and the governments have responsibility, and they're allowing direct foreign investments to come into Africa that only focus on some of these resources that we have. Because we see a lot of oil discovery still taking place, mining is taking place, and those have negative impacts on the environment. And what do they use to defend that? Adequate compensation for the people. That's what they care about. My question is, are we really going to look at the compensation now to determine our future in regards to the climate. Number two, how do we strike a balance now between our need to grow our economies, the resources we have, while also protect the environment that we have? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kennedy. We've technically, sorry. Yes, so I think you have an answer here.
Sure. I'm sorry, I don't have an answer to the question, but I do, or the comment, but I do have two very quick sources that I thought I should share before rushing off. And the one is that on the topic of climate change litigation, there's a really growing body of scholarship on this important area, and climate litigation is really flourishing in the global south. One of the resources where you can find some information about this is a project of the Global Network for Human Rights and the Environment on climate litigation in the global south, written exclusively by global south scholars. And so it's a really exciting area where a lot of human rights arguments are being used to bolster responses to climate change. So I would encourage people to go and look at that. It's on the global GNHRE website. And then another really amazing resource is the Sabin Center's network, at least website of climate change litigation. So this database with basically every climate case that's been decided in the world so far. So the Sabin Center of Columbia University, SABIN. And again, really brilliant database and lots of answers to be found about what's happening in climate change. There's also a brilliant blog that they do with lots of exciting developments. And I think that the space here is huge. So we've got free prior informed consent being used. We have a brilliant constitution with amazing standing rights. So we don't have a lot of the obstacles that we see in the global north, where there are very traditionally liberal constitutions prohibiting climate change arguments from being brought to the courts. And so it's an exciting space, and I hope you'll explore it more.
Thank you so much. I'm sure that answers the issue on litigation, but I will just give maybe a few seconds for anyone who has any burning issue to say before I hand over to Lloyd, who is going to thank all of us who've been here and then close. We have a colleague, Ashwani.
Can I just come in on this one?
Yes, yes, please. Ashwani, before you. Proceed, please.
Are giving me the opportunity? Thank you. I'll take a few seconds. You know, for me, the points that have been made are so important because the climate change crisis and the environmental impacts give us a huge opportunity to realize that as a continent, this is the opportunity to become one. This is the opportunity to get to know each other and start working on an issue, the impacts of which know no boundaries, no borders. And therefore, if we as Africa, as the continent, would start understanding what the essence of these concepts would be for us, for our own self-determination, the concept of just transitions, and really be aware of the power play that is involved in all these concepts that appear as the actual panacea towards us effecting the change. And to understand that as Africans, we have a real duty to be acting in Africa, to bring up an Africa for Africans. And if we understand the need for Africans now, which is, let us completely reverse the status quo of being utilitarian to the rest of the world, particularly the global north. If we could get to that point and use the approaches to litigation to achieve that, we will see ourselves mobilizing so concertedly, particularly on critical issues such as what does just transitions mean? And we move very, very powerfully on that. Issues such as what does the bringing into effect of free, prior, informed consent for communities actually mean? And we unify that and we harmonize these things and we become power in the continent to give these tools for our change to come into effect. So that's a broad statement that I just wanted to make, but pinning all of these contributions on the essence of Africa for Africans, please.
Chair, if I can just add one sentence to Louisa's contribution there to say that I do not believe that Africa as a continent can rise to meet any of its challenge, certainly the climate challenge, if we act independently. We have to push for the maximum level of social, economic, political integration. And to end on a light note, if Europe can have a euro, I don't see why Africa can't have an afro.
I don't know how to continue from there. I think from all the conversation we've had today, and as Prof. Naidu put it, we look at it from a human rights perspective. We've been looking at it from a human rights perspective, but I think we need to talk a little bit more as the environment as a subject. And we've seen, I'll take the example of the global north, but also take the example of the global south. We have Canada, the US, and even India, who have given the nature rights. For instance, I think 2 or 3 days ago, the High Court of Madras said that Mother Earth is a right holder and we have to protect her. So I think we need to also think about the environment as a right holder instead of approaching. I think we're at the Center for Human Rights. That's why we think of it from a rights-based approach. And as human beings, we get more scared when we talk about ourselves and we're like, we're not going to be able to survive the environment as much. But I think we need to think a little bit about environment as a right holder. Thank you.
Sitting here, I've been thinking, how do we write this report in order to, to put it on the website? There has been so much, but enough now. As we launch this campaign, as we continue with our activities, you will definitely see a lot more activities coming up on our website from all our units, and how we intend to take the knowledge that we have gained from this event and to save that through work that we do here in South Africa and in the continent. But at the moment, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Lloyd Veer, who is now going to thank everyone who has been here and then to let us go home.
All right, thank you very much. Thanks, Elvis, and thank you so much all for attending this launch. I would like to thank the speakers who have really enriched the discussions and have given us a lot of provoking issues that we need to talk about and that we need to take up as this campaign continues. It is going to continue until the end of the year, but I think for us, hopefully, it can even continue beyond the end of the year when the campaign officially ends, because really we are facing serious threats to humanity and serious threats to Mother Earth. Just to say that as a last point, the Nelson Mandela annual lecture on the 18th of July, the theme of that lecture will also be on climate justice. And we are hoping, I think we've already, I can say it here, we have also just invited Dr. Kumi Naidu perhaps to participate in that particular lecture in Geneva, Switzerland. I just want to add as well that in July, we are going to be having the Christopher Haynes African Human Rights Moot Court competition in Egypt. The hypothetical case that will be argued has got a theme as well on climate justice. So there's so much that is happening. As Elvis has said, the units will be so busy. Each of the units at the center will be so busy. And I'm just inviting everyone here in the room and online to be part of this campaign, to be part of this activism, and so that we contribute to climate justice on the continent. It's our continent, and if we do not act and if we don't do something, we will continue to see the impacts and continue to cry about the negativity that is going on. So thank you so much and a very good afternoon. And thank you to the African, the Human Rights Short Courses team, Dorcas, Dennis, for affording us this opportunity to include climate justice on the program on economic, social, and cultural rights. Thank you so much.